Welcome everybody to today's program on loss, hope, and conservation in Southeast Asian textiles. My name is Deb Clearwaters. I'm the Director of Education and Interpretation at the Asian Art Museum, and I'm joined with my colleague Allison Wyckoff, who's helping with all of the Zoom logistics today. So thank you, Allison, for all your support. And thank you to our speakers for preparing what I know will be amazing presentations, and I'll talk more about them. Allison, if you would go to the land acknowledgements slide, thank you. The Asian Art Museum would like to acknowledge that we are on the unceded ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush Ohlone, who are the original inhabitants of the San Francisco Peninsula. As the indigenous stewards of this land and in accordance with their traditions, the Ramaytush Ohlone have never ceded, lost, nor forgotten their responsibilities as the caretakers of this place, as well as for all peoples who reside in their traditional territory. We recognize that we benefit from living and working on their traditional homeland and wish to pay our respects by acknowledging the ancestors, elders, and relatives of the Ramaytush community and indigenous peoples who might be joining us here today, and by affirming their sovereign rights as First Peoples. Thank you. Pamela says, I heard on the Oxford Asian Textile Group blog, Ruth Barnes founded OATG. I'm watching with 2 Tonkinese cats. I'm in Canterbury. Lovely. And we have the info at Cloth Roads link in the chat. So I hope you're all able to follow the chat. Also want to mention that the museum is using its platform to speak out against anti-Asian and anti-Black hate and violence. And we commit ourselves as partners and allies in fighting for social justice. So this week's been pretty crappy in the United States, with our Supreme Court and many states now creating unfathomable harm for millions of women and their families. And it feels appropriate at this time to have this program that focuses on women's work and women's voices. And I just hope you all are finding ways to stay grounded, to activate in your communities, and to remain hopeful in spite of it all. This program, entitled Loss, Hope, and Conservation in Southeast Asian Textiles, is part of the Rehistory Project. Through interventions in our galleries and public programs, a team of staff are critically examining the history of the museum and its collections with consideration of race, colonialism, and power. And I'm going to put in the chat a link where you may see past programs in this series. And it's going to be right there. So that's the YouTube playlist, and this recording will also join that one. This program was also inspired by a recent special exhibition called Weaving Stories, which was curated by my colleague, Natasha Reichle, who's the Associate Curator of Southeast Asian Art. And she will, you'll see her in a little bit, she's co-facilitating the discussion today. And I'll put a link to that exhibition, which just closed and was a really amazing exhibition. Some of the images that we used in the slideshow were from that show. So today we're going to be looking at how colonialism, changing customs, and contemporary collecting practices have all impacted the use and meaning of textiles in Southeast Asia. The panel will examine textile traditions, the people who made them, and ethical concerns surrounding the collecting and display of textiles. We'll also look at successful models for supporting textile artists, the majority of whom are women. And as I said, I'm really sorry that Julia Brennan is not here today. She's feeling under the weather. Julia, if you can hear us, we send our positive healing vibes to you. And those of you here who are disappointed, we will be reaching out to Julia to try to get her presentation in some other form. Today our speakers, we have 3 speakers: Ruth Barnes, the Thomas Jaffe Curator of Indo-Pacific Art at Yale. We have Kizon, Associate Professor of Anthropology at Seton Hall, and Sandra Sargono, Founder and Director of Tracing Patterns Foundation. And so I would like to ask Ruth to come up on screen And, Ruth is the inaugural Thomas Jaffe Curator of Indo-Pacific Art and a member of the Council on Southeast Asian Studies at Yale University. She received her doctorate from Oxford University and was previously textile curator at the Ashmolean Museum, where she organized exhibitions on Asian and Islamic textiles, early Indian Ocean trade, and the theme of pilgrimage. Her publications include the Ikat textiles of Lamalera and Indian block printed textiles in Egypt, the Newbury collection in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. Her most recent book, 5 Centuries of Indonesian Textiles, co-edited with Mary Collenberg, received the R.L. Shep Award in 2010. Please join me in welcoming Ruth. Ruth, please take it away, and thank you for being here.
Thank you very much, Deb. That was a very nice introduction. I am very, very pleased to be here today. And it's a great pleasure that the Asian Arts Museum is organizing a workshop of this type, which brings together a small group of scholars who have all worked with textiles in maritime Southeast Asia. My own talk will address 2 of the topics, loss and hope, and I think hope will figure prominently. I will not talk directly about conservation, although it is a topic that I'm constantly involved with, especially as I deal so very much with the fragile early textiles from Southeast Asia. And I've always had a great interest in conservation and support that particular discipline. Now, as the very first speaker, let me share my my screen. Okay. As the very first speaker, I think it is important to start out with a map which locates our region geographically. I will be talking, well, this is of course Indonesia, maritime Southeast Asia with Indonesia and the Philippines. I myself have done most of my fieldwork in Eastern Indonesia, although I've traveled, of course, in most parts of the country. But the talk I'm going to give today will focus on the islands of the Lama Holot Islands between Flores and Alor, where I have spent much of my research time. And here you see a sketchy detail map. We will be looking at, in particular, at the island of Adonara and Lembata, where I have worked in this region here in Kadung, and then in Lamalera on the south coast of Lembata. And I've also spent quite a bit of time in Eastern Adonara. I will be referring to that material. The topic of our workshop is really of great importance to the study of the history and cultural significance of textiles and weaving in Southeast Asia. We all have experienced great changes at work in this artistic field, which is, or certainly was in our lifetime, especially rich in the region. I myself can look back on more than 50 years of firsthand experience, and I certainly have seen many changes in the part of Eastern Indonesia where much of my research was focused. The island world that I am so well familiar with is truly of stunning beauty, with volcanoes rising straight out of the deep blue sea. And this particular slide shows you the part of East Flores with the Ilimandiri volcano, the small, very early settlement of Larantuka, and on the back, on the right, the island of Adonara. Culturally and linguistically, this region is quite diverse. It is united by one language, Lamaholot, but there are a great deal of dialectical differences between the islands and even small communities. Quite separate is the region of Kadung at the eastern end of Lambata, where a separate language is spoken, and culturally there's also quite a lot of difference. So this diversity is intriguing and is always reflected in the textiles that are made. Personally, my anthropologist husband, Robert Barnes, and I feel a deep affection for the people of this region. The Solor Strait between East Flores, Solor, and Adonara remains relatively calm even at the height of the rainy season, and it provides a safe harbor for traders and travelers, and has done so from early times on. Although these islands may still seem remote even today, when the Portuguese, as the first Europeans, arrived in 1515, they already found Chinese and Muslim merchants settled in a coastal village on Adonara. We came first to these islands in 1969, and for 2 years we lived in the village of Leobayang in Kadung at the eastern tip of Lambata. We were given a bamboo house in a hamlet that was about halfway up the extinct Kadung volcano. I wanted to learn about local weaving and textiles, and I was bitterly disappointed. We discovered that the Kadung people had actually had formerly a very strict prohibition on weaving, and even in the late 1960s and early 70s, there was very little weaving that was carried out in the region. That to some degree has changed, and I will talk about that more later. The Kadung people, however, are very prolific basket weavers. And so at least I could get an first-hand experience in that craft. But despite this prohibition on weaving, the Kadung, of course, did not go naked. In fact, textiles played and continue to play a major role in all life cycle rituals and in annual ceremonies. We found that cloth exchanged at marriage was of very foremost importance, and hence the title of my talk, "Without cloth, we cannot marry." This is a quote from a weaver friend of mine from the village of Lamalera. At that point, when two people get married, the bride's lineage has to present a deep indigo-dyed cloth to the lineage of the groom, who in return gives a gong, a metal gong, made in Java, or an elephant tusk, usually of Indian or possibly even East African origin. The color of the textile, deemed to be black because of that significant central area, which is really deeply dyed indigo, a very deep blue. This color was very strictly prescribed. As these cloths could not be woven in Kadung because of the prohibition, they were imported from the nearby Ileape region, which still nowadays is renowned for its prolific weaving. And here you have a view of the Ileape Peninsula from our village just below our house in the hamlet of Napovala in village of Leovaya in Kadung. Quite a spectacular view to do one's fieldwork in. And we really did enjoy our 2 years, although they were full of hardship because we had to carry our own water from the spring, which wasn't too near. It was, after all, half an hour trek. And food was scarce, but the people were hospitable and incredibly generous. The Ileape weavers who produce the textiles for the Kadung market actually had to make something that was quite different from their own because of the color restrictions. Their own bright wealth cloth for Ileape had to be red. The same is true for most of the region, actually, and I'm showing you a cloth from Solor, the island just to the west of Lambata, and a cloth and the setting of a bright wealth exchange in the village of Lamalera, where I've also done much of my field work. These women on the left are bringing the bright wealth cloth in big baskets and wooden box to the house of the groom. And on the right, you see a Lamalera bright wealth cloth, red, predominantly red. This, of course, brings up the meaning of color in a particular cultural context. And I want to expand a little bit on that. The color red is called Mayan in Lamaholot, or Mayan or Mayang, depending on the dialect spoken. It also, apart from red, it means golden, strong, and it can even refer to divinity. God or the deity is considered Mayan, which in that case can mean shining, golden, but also red. Red generally is associated with fertility, with wealth, but of course also with warfare because of bloodshed, and with witches. Now, while the Lamaholot people emphasize the positive aspect of red, in Kadung, the negative part is more important. And they associate red cloth with warfare and witches, not appropriate for their bright wealth cloth. Hence, their cloth is black, while elsewhere it is red. The meaning of colors is an important theme, virtually in all human societies, of course, but it is also very often subject to change. It is very important to know the local content and context to come to a meaningful interpretation. Generally, I want to say that in the region we are looking at here, east of Flores, the Solo Islands, the red refers to fertility, blood, fecundity, and divinity. White is often associated with the spiritual world. For example, in Kadung, for every offering that is made, every ritual where one attempts to get in contact with ancestral spirits, white cotton balls are included. And dark blue, black is often associated with the physical world, and therefore with the living. The color triad of red, black, and white was early important in Indonesian textiles. The earliest textiles we have from the 14th, 15th century already show this, the use of these three colors. I'm showing you a cloth from Sulawesi, which is now at the Yale Art Gallery, from Poso in Sulawesi. And it uses predominantly red, but also very prominent deep indigo dyed bands and a sprinkling of white. The same color division appears in this very early fragment of the 15th century, which is in the Mary Kallenberg collection. This brief overview of the cultural meaning of textiles, as well as the acceptance or rejection of certain textiles, demonstrates that any external involvement requires a sound understanding of the local context. In the decades of my involvement with weaving communities in the wider Lamaholot and Kizon region, it became obvious that that change is closely connected to local interest and commitment, and that is quite essential. I want to expand on two occasions where I have been able to observe a marked change. When we started our research in Eastern Indonesia, indigenous beliefs were officially frowned upon as heathen and outdated. The national government and its local representatives required everyone to accept a world religion, which in our region meant Islam or Christianity. Community rituals were associated, which were associated with the indigenous ancestral beliefs, were frowned upon or more often even were banned. However, as several decades passed, there has been a pronounced change in attitude, which we actually found very interesting and in many instances very rewarding to observe. People started to revive ceremonies that had been abandoned, even often actually in response to illness or strife in the community or to poor harvests. It was widely believed that the ancestors were offended and had to be remembered again in the appropriate ceremonies. In some regions, this led to an increase in weaving in order to produce the required gifts of cloth at a wedding or funeral. On Eastern Adonara, this brought about a genuine explosion of textile production. And I'm showing you here a medley collection of hand-woven, locally made and store-bought textiles that were presented at the funeral in the township of Vitihama in Eastern Adonara that we attended in 2014. And on the same occasion, you see women here wearing locally made cloth woven in the village. And in front of them are small stacks of cloth to be offered at the funeral to various relatives. The island of Adonara had never produced textiles that were especially appealing to a collector's taste. The ikat designs tended to be crude or very simple. You can see that here. and were really not very accomplished. And the generous use of garish synthetic dyes was widespread already in the early 20th century. But quantity became more important than quality. And from the 1990s onwards, the demands for textiles to be presented at weddings and funerals grew into a genuine potlatch competition. I attended one wedding in the early 2000s when more than 700 textiles were exchanged, many of them locally woven. These were brought in by women who walked in a long line, each woman carrying on her head a high stack of textiles. And to top it all, finally, a truck arrived with two huge wardrobes on the back. They were taken down, opened up, and they were stuffed full of textiles. These were all to be divided between various parts of lineages, clans that were involved with this particular funeral ritual. And by the end of the whole ceremony, all the textiles had been dispersed to the people who were to receive them. So this is really a remarkable instance where the revival of indigenous customs had brought about a weaving bonanza. The second example I want to mention takes us back to Kadung, where there formerly had been a prohibition on weaving. Some women started to weave during the Japanese occupation in World War II, but the restriction remained in effect in the ritually important old village sites. Women's ceremonial textiles and men's daily wear were imported mainly from neighboring Iliapi, as I mentioned earlier. The men's clothes were dark brown, a dark brown sarong with fine warp stripes. And you see two men in this image here who are wearing this actually in the late 90s. Now, when we returned to Kadung for a visit in 1996, we tried to purchase one of these cloths and discovered that they were no longer available. So these two men here at that time are wearing cloths that they must have bought some decades earlier. This type was no longer available. Instead, we were offered a completely new type of cloth, now woven locally rather than imported from Iliapi, of white, and you see these two men wearing that type of cloth, of white undyed hand-spun cotton with red or dark blue warp stripes, as you can see in this slide. It was considered the appropriate menswear for ceremonial occasions. This new type of cloth had been developed by one woman named Asma Pisang Apevoren. You see her here, working with some, working on dyeing, preparing a plant for dyeing. She was a skilled and very proficient weaver. And she was also interested in developing local weaving in her village. She had founded a Weavers Association supported by government funding. And she had a deep interest in natural dyes and tried out all kinds of new recipes to achieve new tones and colors. Although a Muslim, she had a great devotion to her own local culture and the religious beliefs of the ancestors. She told me that she developed the new style of men's sarong after talking to old people about what they would find appropriate for this new form of ceremonial dress and about what they knew about the dress of the past. She wanted to create something that, and I quote her, might have been traditional cloth if the ancestors had woven cloth, unquote. Following a dream she had, she decided on these white textiles with fine warp stripes. Now, this experience had a remarkable follow-up for me. 10 years later, 10 years after I had my meeting with Asma, I was in Leiden in the Netherlands to research an early ethnographic collection in the Museum of Ethnology. The collection was brought together during an expedition in 1828-29, which was supported by the Commission for Natural Sciences of the then Dutch East Indies. The expedition was, as far as I know, the first one to travel all the way into Eastern Indonesia and on to New Guinea. The team spent some time in Kupang on West Timor, where two Germans, the pharmacist and surgeon Heinrich Christian Macklot and the taxidermist Salomon Müller, visited the island's interior. They may also have crossed over to East Flores and the Lamaholot Islands, as Müller's publication of the excursion illustrates a plate that shows men dancing on solo. The men are dressed in textiles similar to those collected by the Commission. Imagine my surprise when I came to Leiden in 2007 and discovered that the men's cloth Müller and Macklot had collected from the Solo Islands in the 1820s were very much like the textiles developed by Asma in the late 1990s. Now, judging from museum collections and local memory, these white warp stripe garments had disappeared by the mid-19th century. The earlier Dutch collections, for example, do have quite a few examples of this type of cloth, but none that are like these. As the cloths are extremely simple in design, their reappearance in the late years of the 20th century may, of course, be entirely an independent development. Nevertheless, I find it very intriguing indeed that the woman who developed them spent so much time speaking to elders in her community to recover what they considered the cloth of the ancestors to have been like. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. There is one question directly related to your talk that I'd like to take a minute to ask you. Why is red associated with witches? You talked about that a little bit earlier.
Witches are described as having red faces, sometimes red hair. It's very much their appearance that is related to that.
Great.
So they have a reddish aura.
Thank you. And it's amazing how the oral history, that oral history was so fundamental to bringing that tradition back. That's really fascinating how people have those memories and were able to recreate. So thank you for that wonderful.
But I also want to say immediately that we are very critical of our museum collections and collecting practices now, rightly so. But we also have an enormous historical wealth and we have to take care of that and treasure it.
Right.
And that's, of course, where conservation comes in as well.
And make those collections accessible
Absolutely.
to scholars and the communities that would like to reference them. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So really important point. Thank you for sharing that. So next we have Cherry Kizon, the Associate Professor of Anthropology at Seton Hall University. And Cherry studies how the ideas of nation, ethnicity, and self relate to symbols and their transformation, whether approached as material culture, art, or popular imagery. Her principal research is on the textiles and dress of the Bagobo of Mindanao, the Philippines, using multi-site fieldwork to understand contemporary indigenous textile practices while critically engaging with American museum collections from the 1900s. She broadly explores the politics of representation, whether in living anthropological displays of people in World's Fairs, in tropes of indigenism and dictatorship in 20th century painting, and in lexical and visual signifiers for indigenous peoples in the 21st century that diverge from indigenous modes of self-ascription. So Cherry, please take it away.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Deborah. Let me try to share my screen and hopefully that this will work. All right, I think that's fine.
Good.
So first of all, thank you so much for inviting me. I was first brought into this project, I think, because of my prior work with a different Weaver Stories exhibition, which I'll talk about in a little bit. And so because I was brought in because of a video project, I decided that I would indeed focus right on that. And my talk is called Video Gifts, Recorded Memory and Mindanao Cloth Making. And so I have here like an image from that project. It's a screenshot of a video of the textiles that I will talk about today, which is really the work of one woman, Lang Dulay, who's a Tiboli weaver. She died in 2015. But it's also about conversations as well as all kinds of interactions that arose out of creating this video, producing this video, directing this video, and what I learned in the process about how the different kinds of narratives are attached to cloth. And as a scholar, as well as someone who's worked with museum collections, as well as done several, quite a long time, great deal of ethnography, I was struck by how the narratives keep on changing. And I felt that this was a very important thing to talk about, especially to include the voices of indigenous young people today. So, so the project so here we have the Weaving Stories exhibition of 2022, which I'm so sorry I never got to visit it in San Francisco since I live here in the East Coast. But this is like what brought me in here and this fascinating project of the concept of loss, hope, and conservation. But I also have here the beginnings of how I even got involved, which was an exhibition called Weaver Stories at the Salon Museum. Roy is in the audience, so Roy brought me in for this one, where he asked, and it was a fabulous project with Jill Forshey and Charlie Gavin, where he actually presented a very interesting challenge of creating an 8-minute video that was going to be an integral part of the exhibition itself. And I show you here a shot of how it was like a dual mode of a narrative. I believe from what I've seen online that the Weaving Stories project in the Asian Art Museum in San Francisco had a slightly different focus about into the notions of intimacy and how weavers talk about and think about their craft. And so I felt that bringing some of my reflections on the prior project as well as things that have happened since then would be of value to people who are present today. So it's like a 3-part thing, right? There was the exhibition and there's the exhibit today. And in between, I was able to write about parts of the experience that never made it into the video. And Roy and I have had many, many conversations about this. And I wrote about that, right? The challenges of video in an exhibition, wherein you go out there and you have a brief, But then when you get there, the weaver wants to talk about something else. So what do you do, right? So these are some of the challenges that came up. I did want to note that the image on the right is the last image in that video. And I think I can put it in the chat later on, the link to that. You can still watch it. Wherein, you know, one of the very last things I asked Langdulay, you know, what do you want to say to the world, right? And she said, you know, do not forget me and what I have to say. So she was a fabulous subject for the video. But as we all know, right, all of these people who work in museums, people who are scholars, people who work in all areas of textiles, even collectors, right, know about the complexities of how cloth gets from point A to point B once it leaves the weaver's hands and the kinds of narratives that are attached to it. But I wanted to tell you a little bit more about the video itself. Right? So it began, essentially, I initially proposed to Roy that it would be a story about two weavers from two distinct communities in Mindanao. So Ruth mentioned the diversity of languages and group identities just in her particular field site alone. And Roy has pointed out to me how in Mindanao, it's actually kind of like even bigger and more complex. So there's several weaving communities in Mindanao. And so these two women, Salintamanon and Langdulay, who are shown here, actually got a government award in 1999. And through the award developed a friendship, but they were from two different groups. So they actually didn't speak the same mother tongue. So the initial plan of including Salinta in the video when we started filming in 2009 had to be shelved because Salinta died that year. And she was my primary informant. She's a Bagobo, Tagabawa Bagobo. And it was very, very sad for me that we couldn't focus on her. So I was able to put her in. But what was also interesting was that in the process of trying to do this film, I encountered this I called it video gifts, right? There were these all kinds of footage that we were about to shoot, but there was also footage that are found in institutional archives. Videographers tell me, people especially in the industry call them the B-roll, right? The kind of footage that videographers shoot as background that you kind of like splice into the main narrative. I found the B-roll footage really fascinating and quite useful. I also got all these, I remembered gifts of footage that was given by informants who became friends. So one of them is a Mandaya. Mandaya is another group, right, that produces some textiles in Mindanao. Manny Ompang gave me a gift of video, like it was a mixtape. He says, here, he says, you know, I made this for you. And in the process of making that video, I rewatched Manny's footage and I was blown away and made use of some of it because some of it he shot himself, but some of it came from a TV show where he was actually asked to speak about his heritage, his textile heritage. And I learned a few things in reflecting on that experience, rewatching what I was gifted long ago from this friend of mine who is Mandaya, an indigenous identity in the Philippines, but who's also a government employee. He worked for then the Office of Southern Cultural Communities in Mindanao, as well as himself being an architect. So he had this many layers of being who he was. I show here just a simplified schematic map. I'm glad Ruth showed the larger map earlier that just shows you the Philippines. And I purposefully keep it simple because there's a lot of information that will be sharing in relation to this one. What you see here is essentially a detail of Mindanao, which is in the southern Philippines. Manila is up here for those of you that are more familiar. So that's where I'm from. And it shows you the southern Bagobo homeland. In the Bagobo would say Tagabawa Bagobo, which basically means southern Bagobo, and the Tiboli homeland, right, which is in this part of Mindanao. It's important to point out that the textiles in the region are quite varied and that there are many distinct textile producing communities. So I list here just as a helpful bit, right, that apart from the Bagobo and the Tiboli, you also have the Mandaya and the Blaan and Subanen. So these are people that what I call abaka or banana fiber with the ikat. But then there's also lots of other groups, and many of you probably encountered their textiles more than what I'm presenting today, which would be non-ikat abaka, which means they also use abaka, but they don't use ikat, they use other kinds of patterning, such as, twill weave, for example. And then there's lots of ikat and non-ikat cotton and silk use among the Manobo, Bukidnon, Maguindanao, Maranao, and others. What's also important to point out is that there is a lot of external and within community consumption and use. So in other words, there will be, by tradition, for example, early studies in the early 20th century show that the Manobo were consistently actually importing cloth from the neighboring Mandaya, for example. But the Manobo would then compose these beautiful poems, right, that would praise the beauty of the cloth. And so in the sense you ask, well, is that a Manobo cloth or a Mandaya cloth? And you could argue that it's a Manobo cloth, except that it was actually made by Mandaya weavers over the mountain. A lot of this kind of complexity, right? When I say external, therefore, it could be between indigenous groups, as well as, of course, within community consumption and use. But when I say external, it can actually also mean, right, collectors who are completely out of this context. And so the complexity is certainly there. Anyone who works with textiles, right, in Southeast Asia kind of are suddenly essentially can't escape it. Textiles are made, textiles are, as Levi Strauss would say, right, like they're good to think. And they think about them all the time and desire them and make them and worry about them, and therefore have kind of interesting trajectories, right, as artifacts. I just wanted to show you like a couple of just quick shots of how, right, how similar as well as how diverse textile production can be. Unlike Ruth's presentation, I don't have a lot of textiles. I mean, comparatively fewer images of textiles because I'm talking a bit more about other things, right? But I wanted to share with you here on the left, a bagobo, a bakaikat skirt at the Yale University Art Gallery when I visited Ruth's collection. And on the right, it's this fabulous Mandaya blouse and skirt that was on display at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. So you kind of see, right, how this skirt on the left, which is a flat, could be then sewn into a tube and then worn in a way similar to what you see on the right. But because there's so much linguistic and ethnic diversity, but there are also many, many group-specific terms for abaka cloth in Mindanao. So here on the top, I just show you a sampling, right? So inabal would be how the Bagobo would call it. The Nawo would be another group of the Bagobo, which would be not the southern Bagobo, but the Klata or Jangan Bagobo. Dagmay is what the Mandaya call it. Tinalak is what the Tiboli call it, and Gampek, what the Cebuano would call it. So you're going to see more of Tinalak today because because of Langdulay, right, who's the focus of the talk, as well as her work, and because of her identity as a Tiboli. So here are two images, which was the problem, right? So the brief was to create a video that was supposed to be for the exhibit, which we completed, and it's a very popular video and people still enjoy it, and I'm just so pleased about it being streaming, because each time I hear new things about it. But the interesting thing was that she interjects, right? So Lamdula interjects. So on the left, you see her sitting in her home where she lives, where she receives her guests. But on the right, you see her in this other house, which she calls the weaving center, weaving sinta, she would say, which in Tiboli would be the big house, the Gonobong, right? And how she wanted to talk about this particular house. I've discussed this in this article, Visual Anthropology Review, and I kind of reflected more extensively on this. But at this point, I just wanted to share that in this particular case, right, we couldn't talk about the house. We had to talk about something else, right? Which is rightly so, right? It's part of the process, right, of interpreting, right, research to a public. But I also discussed in that article, right, the reliance on translators. So I have here Elizabeth Beth Malinog, she's a Tiboli, who I worked with in Manila, and that's in the Starbucks near my sister's house. And then at the bottom, you see an image of myself with Mandulay, with my other friend, who's also Tiboli, Maria Odiaros, who agreed to be my on-site translator, because Tiboli not being a language that I am familiar with. Right? And then here I put an inset, John Dulay, who's Lam Dulay's grandson, who I discussed in the article, right? slowly became part of the conversation, and slowly Maria pulled out and John took over much of the translation. None of which was planned, and it brought out very interesting interactions and completely, I might say, transformed some of the narratives. But anyone who's done any fieldwork in Southeast Asia would know that the fieldwork space, the ecology of the space is a sensory overload. So you're surrounded also by conversations happening. In the bottom right would be Langdulai's daughter-in-law, Simbu Langdulai, one of her grandnieces, Maria Dirillo, and on the left, right, children weaving in and out. So it's all of these things kind of are going on at the same time. Because this is the life that the textiles live in. The context would be amongst people that desire them, love them, understand them, know them, and make them. So one of the big insights, of course, in that project was discovering that translation is very complex, where I had on-site translation from John, translating his grandmother, and then going back afterwards, discussing the translations with Beth, and Beth interjecting and saying, no, let's do that again. And that's not what she said exactly. And it turned out that this was kind of like one of the more famous moments in the film, where she talks about how she would be happy to buy knowledge no matter how much it costs, right? Which kind of really shifted the meanings, right, in that particular moment, and our understanding of how she thought about knowledge. In her position, right, as a very senior weaver, and deciding that she said, I would pay for knowledge no matter how much water buffalo it would cost, because I will spend it on educating my grandchildren. That's what she said. So one of the things that comes up though at this particular point in time is that, the beauty of it is this is an open streaming. So after the film was done and people watched it, including my Tiboli friends, and there were all these other news stories that people said, oh, that's my grandfather, right? Which I didn't know, because the found footage was filmed by Manny Ompang, and all kinds of little, discoveries we find with open streaming video. But what I noticed is that there's a distinct way by which, right, indigenous peoples look at this, and people who are not from indigenous communities look at this. So for people who know them, it's a matter of memory, but for others who might not know them, it's almost like a nostalgia. For people who are knowledgeable about textiles, it's a question of knowledge, which is a system, right, a system of information, as opposed to those who are just kind of discovering for the first time. They think more of as wisdom. And then, of course, there are many who draw on it as a source of inspiration, and then some would argue that it becomes misappropriation. So I'm going to try to kind of pick up on some of these themes moving forward. The interjection is not just the indigenous translators I work with, it was also my cameraman. And this is something that I won't spend a lot of time on this one, but just to show you that on the extreme right is the final shot where you see me and Maria and Mandulay with these balls of abaka yarn on the table. But this shot actually began with a scene on the left where there's a green plastic folder on the table. And one of my cameramen, Danny Ballesteros, decided, he comes from TV, he says, that's not a good shot. So he took it out and changed it. And throughout this process, Langdulay, you could see her face, she's really cracking up. She found this hilarious, right? Because it's like, it's one of those moments where, some norms of TV, right? And some norms of, what's it supposed to look like in Langdulay's house, right? Have this kind of interjection editing. I didn't really want to stop Danny, but I just observed it. Because, what would I tell him? Hey, put the green folder back. That would have been very strange. But it was one of those things that Langdulay is also quite used to. She sees it, she observes, and she knows, right, that her narrative actually becomes used in this kind of, you might say, really interesting ways. So the insight from the whole video project, right, thinking about the textiles, thinking about Langdulay, how she thinks about the cloth. The challenge for a scholar is, how do you kind of bring that out? How do you make sure that the narratives that that you represent are actually, right, valid, right? This is a question of validity. And so one of the things that was most useful for me and will continue to be useful for me is the notion of situated listening, which is a concept by Roger Sanjak, wherein one is very aware, right, of dynamics of power between you and the person you're interviewing. So much so that most of us, when we enter these kinds of contexts, we think of ourselves as the interviewer, and our subject will be the one who will then give us answers to our questions, when in reality it should really be reversed, wherein our subject should actually determine the topics of conversation, and then tell us what it is on their mind. On the left is an image of John Dulai talking to his grandmother's sister, Lingam, who throughout the filming was very quiet and very kind of reserved. But then when John and her were talking, she kind of opened up and got animated. John picked up the microphone and suddenly she was a different woman. Right? Those kinds of things are I'm sure, are very common insights that people have in the field. And on the right, it's another one that didn't make it right to the video, but it's Lulai, right, explaining, right? So she was always in this teaching mode because she understood her government award was to teach the making of the Boldy textile to the next generation. So she was always kind of this very interesting teacher mode. She was thinking about it, and she was talking not just to Boldy weavers, her kinswomen, but also the public. And she was quite aware of this and was very proud of this position that she was in. But the important thing to note, and I'm not going to discuss this, but it's just a schematic of the kinship networks, right? With Langdulai's community during the time when she was operating the weaving center, that it's essentially it's embedded in family. And so there's a preponderance of students, right? Her students in her center that descended from her late husband's co-wives. It's also interesting that her only surviving son, Flung or Florencio, and his daughter-in-law, right? None of the children weave. They have 3 daughters and 7 sons. The oldest boys with education are often called to assist directly in the center's administrative logistical matters. The youngest son, who I'm in touch with, Delmo, is studying anthropology actually. But you can see that that for this to work, for textiles to be made, for the weaver to be happy and healthy, they need to be embedded, right, in a community that supports them in many ways. One of the things that I brought up when I wrote about this was the fact that when I was about to go to Mindanao and I stopped in Manila, I saw this image in the facade of the National Museum because I was going to attend a conference there, wherein I saw, you might not see it very well, but on the left-hand side, you have these 2 pillars surmounting 2 images. On the left, that's actually the face of Langdulai, with a folded banner. You might not be able to see it very well. And on the right, it's the face of Salinta Amonon. And on the extreme right, you have like the long view of the facade of the facade of the National Museum. And this was interesting to me because when I attended the conference itself, there was very little really that talked about the 2 weavers. It nodded to textile traditions in the Philippines, but there was very little that kind of talked about who they were. And so I was thinking about that, although I found that really so funny. So I said I would show these pictures to them because I thought they would get a kick out of it. But what happened here essentially is, in a sense, they have become a kind of icon, right? So it becomes a gift because their local communities, the municipal government suddenly is very proud of them, right? The governor visits them, and so there's certain gifts about that. But then there's also a curse, right? Because you're memorializing living people who are actually so worried about things like their health, their families, and their livelihood. So there's a certain kind of tension between, on the one hand, right, being raised above in this iconic way, but at the same time, not really approached in more practical ways. And I think part of that, I noticed, arose also out of some of the decisions I made as far as the video was concerned, wherein I made the conscious decision of kind of going against TV norms of 2010 and making sure that all of the footage of Langdulay when she was being interviewed would be tight shots so that she would be not like part of the background, but she's actually like a person, the talking head, right, being interviewed and making sure that the translation, right, was as close as possible to what she actually said, which I believe kind of, in a way, on one hand, right, went against, right, TV norms, because I wanted it to be very clear that she was the person speaking, which is the whole point of Weaver stories. But it also kind of brought us into the other realm, wherein that's also how celebrities are shot. And so there was kind of like this emergence of Abdullah as a celebrity. And so it brings me to this interesting conundrum, and I'll put the links to this particular blog in this later on in the chat as well, where I encountered in preparing for this talk, right? What this article, this blog by Christine Godinez Ortega, where there was a controversy where Langdulay's face, as you can see, was actually put on clothing of these models in a fashion show, and the designer basically used digitized sublimation printing and have Langdulay on the clothing, as you can see. And apparently there were also images of Langdulay, right, on slippers, chinelas, they call it, right, which is, I think, a Spanish term, but Filipinos considered also a Filipino term, which was considered quite problematic, of course, right? It's quite controversial. And seen as yet another example of misappropriation. In this case, it's also Tiboli Tinala cloth, as you can see, right, on the clothing here, but it's also her face, right? So it's like this iconhood that emerged. And but what was interesting, I felt, was the response. It was a very well written blog post. And the response that I'm quoting here, as you can see on the screen, actually came from Delmo, her grandson. And so clear, he says, we're not condemning fashion designers, but they should have cultural responsibility. Our family has filed a protest with the Commission on Indigenous Peoples because he says, nawala ang essence, right? Or nawala means it's been lost, right? Nawala ang essence, the essence is lost, or the effort put into the weaving of Tinala. So what I find striking here is that from the viewpoint, right, of Delmo, who's a young, very good spokesman, not just for his grandmother and his family, but also, right, for Tiboli culture and how they think about appropriation, misappropriation. It's actually not at all what we would think about like a cancel culture at all. It's instead, it's actually a more generous approach, wherein it's not about saying, no, you can't do any of that, you shouldn't do any of that. It's really about, you need to make sure that what matters to us is still there, which is the essence or the effort, right, of putting right, our knowledge as well as our expertise, right, into the textiles themselves. So how do I think about this? And I tend to always go in a direction that tends to be very different from other colleagues who might be going towards in the direction of right, preservation, right? Where we think about, right, cloth as still pretty much a very big part of the lives of people in Southeast Asia. And in this case, I just show you, right, a very common view, shop stalls at El Divinco Market in Davao City, which is, by the way, across from Ateneo de Davao University. So university students walk through this space all the time. And I guess the point I wish to make here is that, even, you might say entry-level cloth like shop grade tinalak, which I agree is really, right, not at all in any way close to the kind of tinalak that Langdulay or her students make. But the act of buying it, even, and as you can see, it's actually, you buy it, it's yardage, right? You buy it by the yard. So, so because your budget will be very small. If we think about them as actually mundane acts of remembering, mundane acts of yearning, both for Tiboli and non-Tiboli, right? Who shop for this non-grade, shop grade tinalak, right? Is that misappropriation, right? So is it more or less like an imagining, a nostalgia, In other words, if you desire for people to know more about textiles as part of, you might say, the heritage of everybody, right, who comes from maritime Southeast Asia, how it surrounds you, how it becomes a very big part of your growing up and becomes a very big part of rituals of transition, right? Then discovering, right, things that are outside of your experience in this case, or as many of these young indigenous peoples who are now actually in university, right, also think about themselves and their heritage, right? I think that it's possible to think about it, right, in a way that is aware, or that we're aware of the danger of misappropriation, to be aware that misappropriation often begins in acts of being well-meaning, right, but can actually go very, very wrong, such as in that. By the way, the fashion show was supposed to be a nod towards Star Wars. So you have all kinds of interesting things going on there. But to think about, right, tradition, right, as also encompassing this, right? So it encompasses this. It's part of this kind of larger understanding of where textiles inhabit social spaces, right, in a world that cares a lot about cloth and the consumption of all kinds of cloth. So this will be my last slide. It's a set of images, right? So one of the very last things that the conversations I had with Ndulay was actually, right, this particular one, which you just saw, where she talks about, don't ever forget me. But what was interesting in this particular episode or sequence is that it showcases a number of things that she was doing. She was again teaching. So here on the right, I show you an innovation that Ndulay did. She was asked by the national government to actually sign her cloth. And so she says, how am I supposed to do that? And came up with the innovation of having one of her grandchildren write her name down. And then, as you can see, she put it in ikat. So she was says, sure, I'll do that. Salinta was asked to do something similar, and Salinta had a completely different response. She says, oh, why are they asking me to do that? I don't understand, right? So it was a response of distress, whereas for Ndulay, it was a response of, okay, let me give it a shot. So both are very important responses, right, to these kind of push and pull of outside forces of textile production. I show you here the opening image in my slide, which is a loom length Tiboli cloth, and the pattern name is Mangala. And Bangala refers to almost like this architectural structure where it's like a big house with many rooms, and inside each of these rooms, there are these little creatures that are put in. So you have, for example, in some of them, you would see the frog, right? And in other rooms, you would see the small frog, right? And then in other rooms, you would see the scorpion, Suyufon, right? So Sufak, Sububon, and then Suyufon. And this would be like a very familiar image of Tiboli textiles for those in the room, right, who know about Tiboli textiles. I know that there's quite a few of you who are quite familiar with Tiboli textiles. So this is kind of like, you might say, the visual grammar of one part of Tiboli textiles. They tend to become the center panel, right, in these large bridewell cloths. But Ndulay, actually, one of the very last things she did was actually to make this cloth. And it's a very different kind of cloth. As you can see, I'm showing you here, it's a screenshot from a video, right? Wherein she basically exploded Tiboli textiles and instead created these bands of specific motifs that she then proceeded to explain. This is what that's called. This is what's that called. So she was again in her teaching moment. And this is intended for her students, it's intended for people who ask, it's intended, right, for people to, and it was actually also a teaching moment for her grandson, John, who was having this three-way conversation at this point in time. And so, as you can see, right, the quality is there. It's Ndulay, definitely here. She's right, the peak, right, of Tinalak weaving. But it was also this kind of like reinterpretation of what it could mean, right, to be able to disambiguate, right, these motifs and put them, right, in isolation for teaching purposes, right? And so and all of these, right, are reflections back, right, on the process of what it means, right, when you seek to represent, right, not just weavers and their stories and their craft, but the larger context that they live in and operate in. So this is the last image that I would like to show. This was just Dulay at the inauguration of her weaving center. This is from B footage, right? B footage from institutional archives. And it's inside of that house. It shows here on the upper left, you see on the wall, kind of blurry, some of those ceremonial shots where she's receiving her certificate from the then president of the Philippines, right? Fidel Ramos, right? And some of the cloths that she has made. And so I present this now really to collectors, fellow scholars, people who are engaged in conservation, to think about, I guess, an extension of context, to think about ethical practices, and as Ruth was saying earlier, right, the importance of being aware of the ethical challenges of some of the collections held, for example, in museums, or still being acquired, but at the same time also to be mindful of what it is that we can learn about them. But in the case of this, I guess my main message would be really like to think about tradition, right, in a very, very different way, and to understand that it continues, and then to understand that innovation can come in all kinds of different places. You could say I'm an optimist, so I'm for the hope as opposed to the loss, without, of course, being naive about some of the challenges that face many of the weaving communities. So I end my talk there. Thank you.
Thank you. Wow, you've given us so much to chew on there, Cherry. Thank you so much. There are some questions, but I'd like to hold these for the panel discussion because I think it'll benefit all of us to be in discussion on these questions that have been shared. And so we have one more speaker. Everybody doing okay? If you need to take a break, of course, we'll be here when you come back. So our third speaker is Sandra Sargono. I hope I'm saying your name correctly, Sandra. Please tell me, please let me know if I'm not. The founder and director of Tracing Patterns Foundation. This is a nonprofit cultural organization based in Berkeley, California. The organization promotes textile studies and indigenous scholarship through international collaborations. Sardjono is also an independent scholar and curator with a special interest in Indonesian textile history and weaving technology. She earned her doctorate in art history from the University of California, Berkeley. So please take it away.
Thank you, Deb, for the introduction. Let me start sharing my slide here. Does that work?
It looks great.
Great. Well, thank you for everybody for joining this program. And thank you so much for the Asian Art Museum, Natasha Reichle, for inviting me to be part of this important discussion, giving me this platform to address the issue of cultural loss of traditional practices and how research, conservation, and collaboration may advocate for cultural resilience. This is a very difficult but extremely important issue. And the reason it is difficult is because tradition itself is ever-changing, as Ruth Barnes and Sherry's have shown, that we're dealing here with a living culture. But yet every generation we mourn the loss of traditions. And for scholars and collectors who studied and gathered material culture, we are constantly fearful that our work and actions will forever change the present. This view was the core of the 1994 book, Fragile Tradition, edited by Paul Taylor, that brought together essays offering various concerns and reasons for cultural loss. And Ruth Barnes actually is one of the contributors for this book. And so I'm glad that today in 2022, we are circling back to this issue, but perhaps with a fresher perspective, moving beyond discussing what causes the fragility of tradition, and rather emphasizing on how we can promote cultural resilience. So how do we go about this? Because there have been already numerous efforts to revitalize traditional crafts through government programs, foreign interventions, local enterprises, and so forth. But this effort, especially when it comes to textiles, tend to focus on exploring their potential for industry, For example, by adapting their patterns and technique to create mass productions, for the tourism industry by having weaver doing demonstration and selling touristic arts, and for the fashion houses to create branding of sustainability for handmade items. Of course, there's not one perfect solution, and it also depends on the end goal of the projects. If the intention, for example, is simply to increase the economic status of the weavers, then employing them to make textiles for a pillowcase, for example, would work perfectly, and you don't have to do anything else. But if the goal is to create cultural resilience, this must involve empowering weavers to be able to decide the value of their traditional textiles and direction that this tradition will take. Here I will present several models that I think is successful, and each one of these is guided by the same goal of keeping Indonesian traditions alive. For this talk, I interviewed 5 people from different organizations, ranging from nonprofits to businesses, and I chose them for their long-term commitments and their grassroots approaches to working directly with the artisans' communities. I asked them about what they see as the need for the artisans and how their organization are structured to answer these needs, and what are their hopes and advices for us. So I want to thank William Ingram from the Threads of Life, Sandra Mirnas from the Nuesa Studio, Nia Flim from Brahma Tirtasari Studio, which is part of the Meet the Makers, Chrissy Guerrero from Borneo Chic, also part of the Meet the Makers, and Reni Manurung from Dame Ulos, also part of the Meet the Makers. And the images that I'm showing here are credited to these organizations' websites. William Ingram and Jin Hao founded the Threads of Life Gallery in response to the loss of heirloom cloths from villages in the eastern Indonesian islands during the 1997 to 1998. This is the Southeast Asian economic crisis. They saw people sold their old ritual cloth because they had no choices. They needed money. And when the Threads of Life Gallery started, it was to discourage the selling of heirloom cloths and to encourage weavers to remake high-quality traditional cloth that they had lost. But as it turns out, this is not a straightforward endeavor. It's not a simple economic transaction. You cannot just tell them to make the textiles and then you buy them, and that's the end of that. Among the many challenges, they discovered that there was a break in the transmission of knowledge of natural dyeing. And I love the way William describes how traditional textiles is a visual expression of many cultural patterns that are specific to a community. These patterns record humans' relationship to each other, with their ancestors and other beings, as well as the landscape where the fibers, dyes, and looms parts come from. So changes in the environment, for example, with the changes from multi-diverse plants to monocrops and deforestation, also changes the availability of these materials, which would then impact the production of textiles. The Threads of Life started a nonprofit arm called the Babali Foundation to do research on natural dyes and dyeing techniques. These nonprofit arms can receive grants, and they work with the rural communities to rediscover and then reintroduce the dyeing skills to the younger generations of weaver. So here we have a change of how the transmission of knowledge occurs from mother to daughter before to now a kind of system of passing on knowledge through groups. If you look at the website of the Threads of Life, it's really such a pleasure to browse. There's a section about field note. This is actually a page from their field notes. It shows here about an indigo dyer in Timor, who is one of the few weavers responsible to maintain the indigo dye pots for her community. She's also one of the few people who have the right to start a new pot, because you have to do a lot of rituals in order to begin a new dyeing pot. This person manages about 12 indigo pots. That's enough for the 20 weavers in her villages. So such surviving unique rural practices is an example of what the threads of life are trying to preserve. Their model is by not providing design input and buying directly from the weavers. The galleries sell high quality textiles in their original format, but they also show the clients the potential for the diverse uses of these textiles as home decor or as wearable items. However, they do not cut up textiles to make new items, except to use some of the not so high quality cloths for the sense of repurposing. This is the second model, Noesa, which was started by Sandy and Anissa to design students from Jakarta who went to Flores and fell in love with ikat weaving. They were asked by the locals to help sell some of the ikat cloths in Jakarta. But then this attempt was not very successful. So they then decided to create a collaborative work with an ikat weaver community in Watu Blati near Momere in the Sika Regency. Learning about the way the Flores weavers work and adapted their design and technique to create the Noesa brand. She introduced new natural dye color to the weavers to create the products, which are aimed for young city people in Jakarta and beyond. Some people might argue that the Noesa model can be seen as potentially changing tradition by introducing these new ideas. But as we had pointed out before, tradition continued to change. And also, side by side with the Noesa brand is the Sandy and Anissa also support the weavers to cultivate. That's called this is a product that Noesa created specifically for their brand. But they also support the weaver to create their own brand, the Watubo brand. And so while the Noesa products are produced with the design and color input from Sandy and Anissa, the other brand was completely dictated by the Flores weavers. Noesa philosophy is a mutual learning and collaboration. They learn from the weavers about their cultures, and Sandy and Anissa also do research on books and articles on Flores textiles, which they then shares to the communities. And in return, the weavers communities learn from them about how to run business, to do invoice, bookkeeping, and doing social media to market their textiles. One of the measures of Noesa's success is the fact that this endeavor enables the weavers to earn enough money to choose weaving as a full-time job. And it even attracts some people who have left weaving to come back and take up the practice again. The third model is the Meet the Makers, which is a nonprofit organization that directly links artisans with buyers. It is an umbrella organization for many local artisans that spread across Indonesia. And the core approach of the Meet the Makers is sharing resources and use them to empower the individual groups. And each one of these groups have varying way of operation methods. But as an umbrella organization, the Meet the Makers doesn't provide design input. Instead, it aims to promote artisans to be designers of their own crafts. Their show that's always centered on the idea of crafts as arts took place in Jakarta as well as abroad. This is way before COVID happens, obviously. And in practice, the Meet the Makers is a volunteer group, but with a few individuals as the driving force behind it. This includes Nia Fliam, an American batik artist from the Brahma Tirtasari studio, and Chrissy Guerrero, a Philippine social entrepreneur from the Borneo Chic. While each of these two organizations differs in their artistic expressions and outputs, they both believe strongly that traditional culture survival is linked to the environment. And as Sherry was saying before, I think it's very important also for the weaver to be embedded in the community that supports them. Borneo Chic motto, for example, is creating a sustainable environment by utilizing non-timber products that will not destroy the rainforests. And they employ traditional technique to create wearable products. However, they are flexible in changing their design and color to suit the local market. The Brahma Titasari studio, on the other hand, focuses more on the individual's journey of creativity and connecting with nature through the art and the ancient philosophy of batik. And their batik art is an expression of that exploration. Through their nonprofit status, the Meet the Maker was able to apply for grants. They help artisans to become more entrepreneurs, such as teaching them about social media and how to take good pictures of their products using mobile phone and etc. They also created a series of lectures that brings together artisans and scholars in conversation. And by giving the artisans platform to speak and represent their own culture, the Meet the Maker succeeded in further cultivating new leadership in many weavers' communities. One of these inspiring new leaders within the Meet the Maker is Reni Manurung, a Batak weaver in Selindung village in North Sumatra, who started a group called Dame Ulos. Ulos for Batak people is an important type of cloth used in ritual and daily life. Reni came from a weaving family, but in her village, weaving was considered a labor profession and very low status. So people like Reni, who actually went to college, usually do not go back to the village because this would be considered a failure. But Reni decided to come back and take up weaving. Her motivation is in line with the Meet the Makers, which is to elevate the status of weavers as artists. She does so by going deeper into her own culture, studying Batak textiles, learning about natural dyes and introducing them to the community, and aiming to recreate high quality ulos like those produced in the past. She started with just a handful of weavers, but now Dame Ulos incorporates about 100 people. And when I asked her what is her main challenge, she said the main challenge is her access to old cloth for samples. She learned about many ulos through reading Sandra Nissen's book, Legacy of Cloth, and also her interaction with her. And she said that many of these ulos that she saw in the book, she's never seen and never touched. So one of her dreams is to research ulos in museum collection in Europe and the United States. I wish I had more time to speak more about other inspiring young women who are now leaders of their community and become spokesperson for their culture, because I believe that they are our hopes. I just would like to summarize this four model of engagement that I've spoken. They have many varying approaches, but the several common thread that they have is that they generate income for weavers. They're built on a long-term commitment. They involve outside input, either foreigners or the experience from the city or college, but something that is coming from outside these rural areas. These approaches are sensitive to the local need and their worldview, and also they enable learning and empowering the artisans. Let me turn briefly now to the Tracing Patterns Foundation. Unlike the previous models, we do not sell weaving products, but rather we focus on research and access to information on traditional cultures. One of our main projects today is the conservation and publication of an archive from the Belium Valley in Papua, Indonesia, These are materials that were collected by the late Dr. O.W. Hampton, an American geologist and ethnographer who collected them in the 1980s and 90s. And these are the time when the Dani and the Yali people were still using stone tools and fiber technology for most of their utilitarian and ceremonial needs. The archive consists of more than 1,000 objects, 20,000 slides, hundreds of sound recordings, and these were all given to the foundation in 2020 after the families having many years trying to make an effort to place this archive in a museum with no success. And our end goal is finding a home for this collection, ideally by returning them to Papua so that they can be available and used by the local people. Our other activities is organizing conferences, publishing an online journal and books. And last year, we produced a children's book focusing on the ikat tradition in Sabu, that one on the bottom right, called the Mayan Palm Flower. This was done in close collaboration with Genevieve Duggan, an anthropologist of Sabu culture, and Isedara, a weaver from the Tewone Rise weaver group in Sabu. Ise, like Rennie, is a college graduate. She is a teacher, and she is also a leader in her weavers community. I hope to do more collaboration such as these, which allows Tracing Patterns Foundation to serve as one of the links that connects rural weavers to the global and modern world. Finally, I would like to begin with this slide, which gives a sense of hope. On the right is a photograph from 1917 showing a royal woman from Tarutung in North Sumatra wearing ulos ragiduk maronda. This is actually a snapshot I took from the Weaving Stories exhibition at the Asian Art Museum. Many examples of such fine textiles can be seen in museums' collections, such as the one in the Yale Art Gallery in the center. And for a long time, nobody made this textile anymore in this region. But Reni Manurung was able to make these textiles, as seen on the right, based on an old cloth belonging to her mother's friend. So I would like to finish with a hopeful note that tradition may be fragile, but they can be resilient with the practices when the practices are being honored and allowed to thrive in accordance with their own worldview. And what is lost can also be rediscovered if the new generations of weavers are given the platform to represent their own traditions and become their own researchers by offering them access to old archives and collaborations with the outside world. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandra, so much. Thank you to all of our panelists today. Wonderful presentations. And now we'd like to ask everybody to turn your cameras on, our panelists to come back, and we'll begin a discussion and Q&A. So welcome to Natasha Reichle, my colleague here at the museum, who's our associate curator for Southeast Asian art. Welcome back, Ruth and Cherry. And just a huge thank you to all of you. This is incredibly enlightening, and for someone who works at a museum and is responsible for assisting with the interpretation of these collections, this has given me so much to consider. So thank you all. The first question, I think, is for Ruth. Do you have any idea why this prohibition on weaving existed in Kadung?
I don't have a definitive answer at all. In fact, this has been puzzling me for now 45 years. But we are looking at a much wider area of weaving and non-weaving cultures, which actually are found throughout many parts of Indonesia, if not all. And what is, well, there are two issues here. One of them is that this part of Eastern Indonesia is relatively close to non-Austronesian cultures. Non-Austronesian cultures tend to be non-weaving, while many Austronesian cultures spread throughout the maritime world, brought their weaving from, well, ultimately, there's some argument about this still, but almost certainly from Taiwan. Ultimately coming from southern China as well, connections exist there. So we are in Eastern Indonesia, we are actually looking at regions where weaving and non-weaving societies, cultures, communities are really very close together. And the weaving communities support and supply the non-weaving communities with textiles. This is a very widespread exchange of productions. We get specialists who make, well, as in Kadung, baskets, or specialists who are metal workers, make pots. And then these are taken to local markets and supply communities that do not make their own pots. So it's a complicated but historically very interesting issue. And I hope to actually follow that up in much more detail finally when I'm cataloging currently our collection of Indonesian textiles and aim to attempt a history of Indonesian weaving to be published in a few years. So that's something to work towards.
Thank you.
I don't have the final answer, but it is something where we have many pieces to the puzzle that still have to be fit together.
Thank you, Ruth. We're all looking forward to that publication when it does come out. I wanted to go to another question that came in the chat, a more general question from Saloni. How do we connect with organizations that are working on conservation of some of these weaving and other textile techniques in Southeast Asia? So I guess it's a general question to organizations that they can reach out to, or just where do people go to find out this information?
I think in my experience, the best way to do is to find a scholar who have done studied on that culture, because they would be, I think they would know who are organizations that are active and working with the particular communities, because this field is so highly specialized and people specialize in different regions, and it's so varied. So that's one approach, I think.
And then there's a follow-up question from the same person of what do the panelists think, and I think Cherry addressed this a little bit, of designers and brands working with endangered textiles or textile traditions and artisans as revival projects. Will it be seen as cultural appropriation? And maybe Cherry can talk a little bit more about that, or anyone else.
I tend to, that's a great question, but I was so happy to also hear about Sandra's work and her research in what's happening in Indonesia. It's an old question, right? About, I mean, there's an older model wherein fashion designers as well as artists would just say they're a source of inspiration, and therefore I don't really need to engage with them directly. I just have to read books. I have my own collections. So there's that kind of existing model, but I'm seeing more of the newer models wherein perhaps because of social media, it's actually easier for young designers to actually look for direct contact with the community and ask them to engage and ask them to collaborate. So I think that it really depends a great deal on the nature of the collaboration, because it was very, very quick in the case I showed you earlier. the backlash was very fast. And that was partly because of social media, right? And also because indigenous communities, I'm sure it's the same in other parts of Southeast Asia. It's not so much laptops, but cell phones. And folks in the deepest mountains are on Facebook. And so, among other things, right? And it's a very different kind of telecommunications infrastructure, wherein depending on, you know, the amount of data you have access to, right? Whether you can play videos or just do Facebook Messenger, for example. And so it's very difficult nowadays for fashion designers to say that, you know, that it's not possible for them to reach out and actually have a collaboration. Without that kind of partnership, and I think there's some wonderful examples that Sandra showed, right, in Indonesia. I was also heartened to learn that Chrissy Guerrero is there. I know Chrissy from before with her work in non-timber forest products. So when it becomes cultural misappropriation, it tends to be quite visible and quite evident. So in the case of that fashion designer, you know, to even put the image on footwear, right, was especially problematic. That I don't think you even need to be culturally specific to Southeast Asia to say there's something wrong with putting someone's face on a slipper. And so there's a great deal of like you might say a learning curve in terms of, you know, of appropriateness. However, I think that it's to be encouraged, right? The curiosity and the interest. I think that indigenous, young indigenous designers, right, and weavers, as well, people whose families are embedded in it, but not necessarily practitioners themselves, are very actually open, right, to these types of collaborations. And I think that you know, and I know some of certain examples, right, in the Philippines. The models are all very different, as Sandra pointed out. So one of the ones I know of that has gone for the slow fashion movement, right, is Philippine Ina, for example, where she applied the principles of you know, basically finding a way to measure the amount of work that a woman could put into, let's say, embroidery, and then pay them a certain amount that is consistent with their work. And it's very true, the desire to work, but the desire to have clarity and how you will be compensated. And also, and this is an important point, right, the desire and the ability to be able to make decisions about, right, the money that you make are crucial for buy-in for women to participate. But on the other end, I know of one shop in Lake Cebu, for example, right next to the place that I stayed, that's a women's cooperative, wherein they basically have women come in and place their products. And there's a big, enormous paper ledger where, you know, everything from earrings to loom length cloth, right? The back office is all manual, it's all handwritten, right? And the tagging and the pricing is all handwritten. However, it was something wherein women can come in and say, I've made this on my own, right, during my downtime, and there's a price. And when it gets sold, I come back to the shop and I get my money. So a little bit of, you know, different kinds of models that do happen. But they certainly can help, can get the help of, you know, certain things like, you know, business systems, for example, will help them so that they don't have to do some of these things on paper. And of course, marketing, as mentioned by Sandra. So, but what's interesting is that there are many different attempts to try to do it. So on the fashion end, you still see some of these, you might say, tin-eared attempts in some cases. That still happens because it becomes now an emblem of being, I don't know, I don't want to use colloquialism, but it's an emblem of being kind of woke, right? As in, I'm into tribal culture, therefore look at me, I have this t-shirt, right? And even though sometimes you would discover that the t-shirt was actually made by a settler, I suppose, right? So you get into these very interesting situations because of, you know, we kind of go back to Walter Benjamin and mechanical reproduction, right? Those kinds of issues kind of come up. But I feel like, you know, if you are committed to it and if you really wish to have a collaboration, it's not impossible. It's actually has happened in a number of cases. Sorry for the long-winded answer, but I pass it on to Sandra, who probably has a lot more to say on this.
Yeah, I'm very worried of attempts to celebrate culture. I think this is where the appropriation can happen. Every time we have this kind of discussion, it always reminds me the Uniqlo. One time they come up with this product in Indonesia, and this line is specific line is the branding Javanese batik. But when you look at what, first of all, it's printed, and then the design is not even traditional. But then they have this little tag that talks about batik and how it's now one of the UNESCO intangible cultural heritage. And I'm just thinking to myself, how could they? Who approved this? How can they get this, on the market? And then, there's just so many of those examples where it seems to celebrate culture, but they're not really acknowledging the maker, and the actual, the beauty of the real textiles.
Thank you. Another question that just came in, I'm just going to read it off to you. I'm curious about how contemporary conservation practices navigate the tension between supporting weavers as individuals, both artistically and financially, who might benefit from the new markets, including outside the immediate community, versus preserving communal traditions in which textiles are intended to circulate within a community rather than as commodities. I ask as a Batak American who has a number of ulus that I have received through my family ceremonies. I love them and want to hold on to them, or even buy more, maybe from Dame Ulus, or introduce others to their beauty. But I also feel like their meaning comes not just from the patterns or production techniques, but from those exchanges, and that there's an expectation that they should continue to circulate within the community. I feel comfortable giving ulus to non-Batak friends as gifts, but the financial exchange feels quite different. And this question ties into just a very large question that I've been thinking about, hearing stories that people have mentioned about the selling of ritual cloth and sort of the history in most museums of seeing things like ceramics and textiles as these exchange goods that don't have the same conditions of, there's less moral ambiguity about them being traded than there would be a statue or a piece of architecture. And I'm really interested in sort of the complexity of that issue and the ethical concerns with collecting textiles that were once and still are in certain places very important parts of these community relations that this person was just talking about.
To what degree is that different from collecting manuscripts or precious ceramics? I don't really see the difficulty in that. I mean, I see the difficulty in collecting pieces that were once sacred heirlooms, or treasures that belong to a family or to a particular household. That, and collecting that, then removing it from its context, that affects, that's a general problem, I think. It's not specifically textile related. In fact, I think in many, certainly in communities that I know, people, for example, the women of Lamlera produce textiles that are specifically linked to their lineages, patterns, and they recognize that. and they use those textiles within the circulation in the community, but they also sell them, and they have sold them for, you know, several hundreds of years, because they also are professional weavers. So that can work both ways. And you know, when Sandra was introducing those various NGOs and community efforts, or commercial efforts to sustain and support weaving communities, I think the most successful ones are the ones that actually work with professional weaving communities, where women are used to think about their cloth not just being for internal use, but for moving outside the community. There's no problem about that. And if you get paid for it, oh, that's great. But you still make the cloth that you need. You know, it works both. You can work on both, in both directions. But where these efforts to support a weaving community and you know, make the women weavers confident in their artistic works, where they don't have that professional experience, it usually is a failure. I mean, not all of those attempts that Threads of Life, for example, has made in Eastern Indonesia have been successful by any means. Mm. I know in one case, for example, where they tried to connect with weavers in Lamalera, they were very well-meaning, and they certainly wanted to support local weavers and pay them generously. But my God, that village is, if you've lived in it for several months, you will know that there is a lot of competition in that village, and there's a lot of strife, internal strife and jealousies. So my goodness, the tongues were wagging about how much money people were getting from Threads of Life and it all went to one family. So it turned into a failure. While the women who weave in, say, in Sika or in Leo, where they've had a long, possibly a couple of centuries of producing both for internal and external purposes, this is much more successful and really quite impressive. Wouldn't you agree, Sandra?
No, I completely agree. I think on your first point that I don't think there's any conflicts of people selling their weaving and also making products for their rituals. I think that is, if you can't do the first, if you can't make money, then you will have to stop the weaving. I think this the whole models that I talk about, it's kind of on this idea that you have to sustain yourself. Because it's not only, I mean, just relying on the community around you to have the need of this cloth, it's no longer sustainable. We've transferred from the barter system to now cash economy, and that already create this need to generate incomes in this way. And Rennie herself, I think, was telling me that when I want to address the circulation of cloth, she said that the one cannot make a cloth for oneself. So if she needs an ula, somebody else has to make it for her. So there's, in some culture, there's already that need of the circulation. So she can't, that's sort of like embedded in the system. But of course, yeah, every place is different.
I wanted to actually pick up also on the initial question about the notion of, do you deal with an individual weaver as opposed to an entire community? And in my own experience, I observed what kinds of customary models were in place and worked with that. And so what I noticed was, with dealing with weavers who do indeed make cloth for their own, let's say, family members, right, as well as cloth for sale, they're quite used to, it's almost like a commission. You sit with them and you negotiate. What do you want? What can they do? How long it will take? How much will it be? What do they want ahead of time? And it's true that's what they also would do with members of their community who wish to commission, because the cloths in Mindanao especially, they become so precious because about the labor, right, that go into ceremonial cloth of high quality. So indeed, there's a great deal of loss and theft, right, wherein you have families that hold on to them, but then there's always going to be some relative who takes it from their grandma's, right, stash and sells it. We have all of these stories, right? But the point I make is that at the point wherein you wish to have a cloth made, for example, it's actually quite customary. They're aware of it, right? So it's just a matter of kind of meeting them at their own level. What is it that they wish from you? What are the conditions that they wish from you? As well as, of course, this interesting situation where if they don't like you, they won't make it for you. If you offend them, they'll find a way. I'm sick. Something, right? So it's also that this interesting kind of very personal negotiation that takes place, which you need to be respectful of. But that's a very important point, right? That weavers are, they do understand the value of what they make, but at the same time, they also need to pay their bills. They need to they have to worry about the crops. They have to have tuition for their kids, right? So there are all these things that are happening in their heads. One of the things I noticed with Langdulay was that she was actually training her students also in the process of negotiation. So I very rarely buy when I'm in the field, because whenever I start doing that, then people deal with me in a different way, right? I become a buyer. I don't really want to buy any. I just take pictures of everything, but I never ever buy anything. And so in this particular case, I was feeling this nudge that Langdulay wanted me to buy something from her student. And so I did, and it was interesting. She was basically guiding her towards, how to do the, even to the point of, how much money to ask and how to hand the money over. And then as soon as I gave her the money for that particular the student made, her student gave Langdulay a cut, because, and we think of it as a cut, but it's actually what you would do, right? Because, she was her teacher. And so this happened right there in front of me. So there's this mentoring that's happening too, in terms of, how to deal with market forces. But what's also interesting, I felt, was that the Tiboli are much more engaged with market forces, partly because there was a Catholic mission that was in place in the 70s that set up a shop. And whereas the Bagobo did not have that experience. So you see it in the cloth themselves. So you will not be able to purchase a Bagobo cloth as yardage, for example, but you could purchase a Tiboli cloth, right, as yardage, because the Tiboli actually will produce cloth that is in rolls as yardage, because that's not their ceremonial cloth. The ceremonial cloth, of course, are, right, bride wealth pieces, mother piece, right? So it's like, so there's this kind of a community adaptation to market forces that are already there, which really belies the narrative of, such, that they are at risk and, traditions dying, right? And, we have to rescue them and all those kinds of narratives that sometimes they do like to use because it brings up the price, right? Sometimes they like that, right? They do make use of that narrative, but at the same time, right, we have to also be aware that, that it's what they need. We need to ask them what they need, right? For these kinds of encounters. So if you think about it, it's like, like 2-3 generations of responding to market forces. You have one community that produces cloth that they know is for the market, and one community that still doesn't. And I'm actually kind of curious to see if they will. I'm kind of observing. I don't know if they will, because of life, right? Livelihood. It really, as some of the viewers said to me, when we had paramilitary forces and insurgencies and bombs exploding, who can weave, right? When you have to kind of keep on evacuating during times of war. So that's kind of my response to that. That both models exist. You have these weavers who rise in seniority, and Ruth is right. It's not just one family; it's several families. But then what happens is that when you get celebrities like Amdulai, then it's only her family, when in reality there's several really, really good weavers, right, in that community, but only one rose to this level of fame, for example. And then what happens when they die, as she has, right? And what happens to the production of people that she worked with. The second point that you were asking, Natasha, I thought was interesting, right? About thinking about exchange goods, right? That we think about them in a more prosaic way, well, as opposed to, let's say, ceremonial goods, and they are in museums. And yeah, I tend to agree with Ruth that if we preserve the context, or we know the context by which they enter the museum, I guess it helps us make decisions about their interpretive value, as well as, I guess, their ceremonial value. Because even if it's only, you might say, an exchange good in the terms of, this is worth 7 heads of cattle, for example, that's a big deal. So it's, the prosaic is actually a big deal. So it kind of ties into all kinds of notions of merit, right? So the economic becomes a moral ideal. Actually, it's a measure of your value, right? As a weaver, if your cloth can be, right, poems are written about it, songs are sung, right, and it's equivalent to many, many heads of cattle, right, for example. So the prosaic is actually, right, it's got a lot of moral ideas in it, I think. So yeah, it's a great kind of question to ask of collections, I think.
And there's 2 quick questions, hopefully, that we can get through in the Q&A. One is for Ruth. It says, Dr. Barnes, you mentioned the origins of Austronesian weaving cultures being probably from Taiwan, which itself is not in Indonesia, a modern day construct. Isn't there a strong argument to be made that studies and books should not be on Indonesian textiles, but preferably Southeast Asian textiles?
I think that depends very much on the geographical context. Yes, of course. And there are a lot of studies that are on Southeast Asian textiles. There are studies where it would be much more appropriate to talk about Austronesian weaving, and that would reach from Taiwan into even some Pacific islands, certainly into Southeast Asia, both maritime and parts of mainland Southeast Asia, and all the way to Madagascar. And then there are, it depends on what collection you are investigating, and with what kind of a collection you use as the foundation for your study. But I'm not taking sides on that issue at all. I'm quite open, and one should be, I think.
Great. Then one more question. For museums that have been gifted Southeast Asian textiles from the mid to late 20th century, what is the possibility of working with the communities to identify the weavers or even the village?
May I answer that again?
Yes.
I think that's a very good chance for that, actually. I've done that on several collections, museum collections, and to a large degree with quite a bit of success. The earliest collection that I've worked with, where I could actually go back to the regions, is a collection in Frankfurt, the Asvata collection, which was brought together in 1928-29, and it was based on an expedition that traveled from East Flores to Alor, And I've retraveled that entire expedition with really moving from community to community, seeking out people who remembered the visit. Those people were, of course, very old by then. This was in the late 90s, early 2000s. But we were surprisingly successful in finding actually connecting objects with named, with the names of people, and tracing the descendants. So that's a very interesting, wonderful way of making use of museum collections. Something I would very much encourage curators to continue with.
For those kinds of things, I find that if the collection comes with enough robust information, such as, Ruth was saying of an expedition, right? Or in my own case, it was a matter of finding collections that had really good, it's not just even provenance, it's really just, it's embedded in this kind of entire narrative of people with diaries and, thoughts and places and all that, then it actually makes a lot of things possible. Place names and dates, as well as specific information that we gain from the cloth itself, right? We learned the degree by which they use shop-bought thread as opposed to their own thread and all that. But the question seems to also be about, if people gift things to museums, and that always is a matter of it depends, right? But if it comes with the context, then I think yes, I think that I love doing that kind of stuff too, right? Being able to kind of piece things together, although perhaps not at the degree of success that Ruth has had in being able to trace them to specific descendants. I did observe though that weavers who I did interview throughout Southern Mindanao had a very interesting awareness of who made what. So just an image of a textile from, a blurry 3x5, they'll say, she, they'll tell me, and I just spoke to her last week, right? So and then they say, oh, so it's this kind of very interesting memory of the textiles themselves are recognized, right? Say, and that belongs to that family, which was stolen at such and such. So there's a lot that can also be done, right, with photographs, I think, that kind of bring out these forms of elicitation. And yeah, so it can be very, very exciting and interesting.
Wow, thank you for such a rich 2 hours plus a few minutes. Really, I want to appreciate our panelists today. There's many comments in the chat appreciating your talks and the discussion. And I'm sure there are a million more questions people have. Sandra just put her email in the chat, and I'm sure you can track some of these other speakers down if you have follow-up questions. Thank you, Natasha, for really coming up with the concept for this program today, and also introducing me to these amazing scholars and, dare I say, activists who are supporting indigenous and local traditions in Southeast Asian weaving culture. So thank you all so much. Thank you to our audience for being here. And we will put the video for this program on our YouTube channel, as I mentioned earlier, so you can come back and refer to it. So thank you all. Any final words from anyone?
I just have to say I was struck by how much hope there was in all these presentations, and that's just something that we really need right now. So thank you very much. It's a very nice way to end this presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.